Today we continue our worship series entitled Life in the Right Lane, as we seek to live lives that are correctly lived, lives that are given for the work of God. For the prayer this morning, again, we use the words from Clara Scott, a hymn writer back in the 1800s. She was the first woman to publish a collection of anthems, and the words for her hymn are familiar ones. Let us pray. Open my mouth and let me bear gladly the truth, warm truth everywhere. Open my heart and let me prepare love with your children thus to share. Silently now on bended knee, ready we wait your will to see. Open our hearts, our minds, our eyes, our ears, our voices. Illumine us, Spirit divine. Amen. From the book of James, chapter 3, beginning in verse 2, listen for God's word to you. James writes, "For all of us make mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. But if we put bits into the mouths of horses and make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue. A restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessings and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. 25 years ago, I found myself in a youth retreat outside of Mexico City. There were 7 of us who took almost 100 kids, 100 high schoolers, along with a few other helpers to Cuernavaca, to this beautiful retreat center. And we brought in a speaker from Tennessee who used to have a ministry called Midnight Ministries, Youth Lock-ins and Retreats. And after we brought him to Mexico, he added the word international retreats to his marketing. And I remember that he met with all of us, and he picked one of the kids that had a black t-shirt, a beautiful Nike black t-shirt. You can tell that it was brand new. He brought the kid to the front, and he says, "Can I tie your hands behind your back in front of all the other kids?" And he said, "Okay." Tied behind the backs, and he said, "I'm going to do an experiment. Check this out." And he opens a toothpaste tube and starts writing on his brand new black t-shirt the word "hi," nice and big. The kid was both amused and horrified. And then he says, "Okay, I'm going to untie you. Here's the toothpaste. Put the toothpaste back in the tube." And so the kid actually tried it. He tried squeezing the toothpaste back into the tube, and of course he couldn't. And by then the youth leader already had a brand new, beautiful t-shirt that he gave him after that. And he said, "All right, you may be seated." And he looked at all of us and said, "Words are like that. Once they come out, you can never put them back in." That preaches, doesn't it? I remember that. I remember exactly those words that were spoken 25 years ago vividly, and I think he's absolutely right. Words are like that. Once they come out, you can never put them back in. In other words, words matter. Wouldn't you agree that what you say matters? That words matter enormously, especially if you are a child of God. If you wear the label of Christian, what you say matters enormously. Wouldn't you agree? It's not a rhetorical question. Wouldn't you agree? I think if we submitted it to a vote this morning, it would pass. It wouldn't be unanimous because we're Presbyterian, but it would pass. Words matter enormously. If you don't believe me, just go ahead and finish out loud the saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words never hurt me." Yeah, right. Oh, that's one of the greatest lies that we tell children. Words hurt, and they can hurt enormously. There is great and underestimated power in speech. Friends, for three weeks, we're looking at a short series in the book of James, just an introduction to the book. I encourage you to read it throughout the summer. It's not long, but it contains jewels for daily living. We're trying to live in the right lane, in the correct lane, trying to live correct lives for God. And so James, in this case, wants to challenge us to live the right way. He writes and he challenges and he warns us, especially today, of the power of the spoken word. He says, as we read a few moments ago in verse 10, from the same mouth come blessings and cursing. And then he says, my brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. I think it's true. I think it's absolutely true. With your words, you can actually bless someone. And with your words, you can tear them down. And actually, it is not an understatement when I say that with your words, you can actually destroy someone. I told you years ago how back in 2005, when I was living in a different part of the world, in a different part of a different church, there was this church member who was very angry at me. I mean, she was absolutely furious, and you can tell every single Sunday, and I didn't know why. I had absolutely no idea why. So one day, I decided to call her, and I asked, are you okay? I think we need to talk. To which she immediately said on the phone, you probably have the idea that I don't like you. And I said, well, yeah. She said, you would be right. I said, all right, so let's talk about it. And so she agreed, and we had a cup of coffee that week, and we sat down, and after we exchanged a few pleasantries, I asked her, so what's wrong? Can you tell me about it? Tell me what's wrong. And she said, it's nothing that you did. It's who you are. And I said, well, help me out. What does that mean? She said, I mean, let's face it. You were born in Mexico. And you represent everything that's wrong with this country. What do you say to that? Well, I can't tell you what I said. Actually, yes, I can. I actually said nothing. I was stunned. And it's been almost 13 years, and I can tell you that I remember exactly where I was sitting, what the weather was like, and even the tone of her voice. Words matter. What you say to people matters enormously, especially if you are a child of God. Have you ever had an experience like that, when someone has hurt you with their words? Last week we saw in James that faith without works is dead. If you want to think it in a certain way, think of the hashtag works matter. But today we change just one little letter there. Never underestimate the power of word hashtag words matter. And they matter tremendously. Last week we spoke about living the right way, and we spoke about it with a global focus, if you remember. We spoke about it also with a national focus. Today I think that would apply as well, but we take a little bit of a different twist. And we do know, and I have to accept, that the use of words and the power of speech and the influence of the spoken word is very, very important in public forum. And I think most of us would agree that it is not stellar these days, is it? I don't know about you, but I personally get really tired of name calling. And there's a lot of that, and the media reports a lot of that. And what's worse is that these words are contagious, and I've heard it not just outside of the church, but I've heard it even in the church. And what worries me is that it's going to get worse this year and even next year as well. But today we take a different focus. Today we take, I think, a much harder focus. I don't think that James gives us a spotlight to shine on the actions of others today. Rather, today James brings it closer to home, much, much closer to home. So think of James's word for you not as a telescope to judge others, but as a mirror to judge your own speech. James would say that if we are trying to live life the right way, then James 3 serves as rumbling strips. As we go on the highway of life, these are rumbling strips, danger strips to tell you you have to have huge warning when it comes to your speech. Why? Because you are a child of God. James is enormously concerned, specifically with the church. James is concerned at what he calls barriers to Christian community and Christian life, and he actually speaks about passion, unrestrained passion, and pride, and judgment, and injustice, and he even addresses later on in this book poverty and economic disparity. I encourage you to read it. It's a difficult but wonderful book. But here in chapter 3, he writes about the most destructive thing to Christian community, and that is our speech. Remember last week I told you that I'm not going to say anything you don't already know? Ditto. Same thing. You know this. I know this. We are people of God, held to a different standard. But this is not new by any means. The Greeks, the Hellenistic culture, way before Jesus' time, they had an aphorism that said, the tongue is by nature pregnant with evil. Would you agree? The Hebrews would, Jeremiah would agree in chapter 9. He says the tongue is a bow and arrow. Think of the imagery right there, a bow and arrow. Rabbi Yehuda ben Sirach, who wrote the book of Sirach, right there, those intertestamental books, in chapter 28, he says that the tongue is not just a bow and arrow, it's actually a sword. Think of that imagery. And then the author of Proverbs in chapter 19, he agrees with them and says that the tongue produces both life but also death. The wisdom is not unique to the Bible either. I think it is something that we are very attuned to these days, the power of words. Gary Chapman, author of the book Love as a Way of Life, writes the following, and I quote, "Words are either bullets or seeds, and nothing more and nothing less. And it's your choice." Rabbi Yehuda Berg said the following, and I quote, "Words are singularly the most powerful force available to humanity. We can choose to use this force constructively with words of encouragement or destructively with words of despair. Words," he says, and I love, "have the energy and power with the ability to help, heal, hurt, harm, humiliate, and humble. The choice is yours." Oh, friends, words can be very dangerous. And so James rolls out some very desperate road signs in our journey of life. Caution, he says, extreme danger ahead. Be wary of the power of your speech. And then he writes some analogies here. He says the tongue, that organ in your body, or your speech, your words are powerful, he says, and they control your entire existence. Not unlike the rudder of a large ship, he says, it's small, but it guides the entire self. And he says it's not only like the rudder of a ship, it is also a bit in horse's mouth. And then he goes down a dark rabbit hole. It is a fire. It is a world of injustice. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Tell us how you really feel, James, right? And he does. The central verse in this section is a rich and beautifully convicting verse. Fasten your seatbelts with his words. He says in chapter 3, verse 6, he says, the tongue is fire. And then he says it can set an entire forest ablaze. Your speech, he says, is a world of iniquity. It's another way of saying, oh, the humanity, it is awful. And that word iniquity can actually be translated as your speech is a world of iniquity, a world of injustice. It is a world of unrighteousness. It's a world against God. Any of those translations would be correct. He says that little thing, your speech, your words, stains and defiles the entire body. And then he says it sets on fire the very cycle of nature. A literal translation is, though speech sets on fire the very cycle of Genesis, the wheel of becoming. This is language that is used to describe in the Bible the last days or the end of times, apocalyptic imagery. It is that big. It sets on fire what God began in the beginning and pronounced to be good. And then if that were not enough, he finishes that section by saying, the tongue is set on fire by hell itself. You read that and you have to ask the question, James, what happened to you? I mean, this is a post-mortem. The man is not writing as Paul writes instructions later on, but he actually writes, I believe, out of a bad experience. The language in this verse and the entire section is emotionally heavy. It is very emotional writing, and you have to ask him, what on earth happened to you? What did they say to you? Maybe they said something to him, someone did. And you can read the blood and the scars in these pages. Or maybe he said something to someone else and he regrets it deeply. And you can taste the bitter regret in these pages. What happened? The Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe someone actually said something to James that hurt him deeply recently. Maybe someone said something to him when he was a child, because words stay with you for a very long time. Isn't that true? We don't know. Some scholars agree that this James could have been the actual brother of Jesus. Can you imagine being Jesus' brother? Impossibly high standards. I can just imagine he is running in the house and he breaks a lamp, and all of a sudden Mary turns to him and says, why can't you be more like your brother? Look at Jesus, he's such a good boy. You think that's it? I don't think so. But maybe someone said something to him at a very young age, because what the words that you communicate to children are so incredibly important, especially as a child of God. Tell a young child you will never amount to anything, and you're pretty much influencing the future of that child. Dr. Barbara Jaffe, regular contributor to Psychology Today, writes how as a child she had this experience. Her mother once sat her down when she was a little girl and told her that she was solidly in the middle of the road, get this, and very average when it came to intelligence. Her mother said to him, honey, you should be happy, said her mother, grateful even. Why is that, Mommy? Because smart people have a lot of problems. And thanks be to God, you don't have to worry about that. Can you believe it? That's what she heard as a child. And so Dr. Jaffe writes the following, and I quote, ever since I have spent my entire lifetime clawing my way out of the mediocrity category. No wonder that Dr. Jaffe ended up in UCLA with an advanced degree in, get this, linguistics. Words matter. And yeah, it might be a little humorous and comical, but at the same time, it's tragic. Absolutely tragic. Maybe this is why James writes in such a bitter and impassioned way. Maybe this is what James heard as a child, or maybe not as a child. Maybe this is what he heard as an adult. It is said that just because something pops into your mind, it doesn't have to come out of your mouth. James would agree. I don't know how you see this passage. I envision James sitting alone in his study. He is sitting right by the window, right on the windowsill, and he is there hurting, and hurting deeply as he reads things or dictates these very emotional words. He's hurting deeply maybe because of someone else's words. Maybe someone said something to him out on the street when he was walking, or maybe someone from his family, or maybe someone said something to him in church. Doesn't happen in church, does it? Then again, I think we can be very ugly to each other, even as children of God. It is no different, sisters and brothers, inside and outside of the church, James would say. You know this, I know this, you've experienced it. And so James reflects on his pain, and I believe he's sitting right there by the windowsill reflecting on his pain, saying words like, words are a restless evil, full of deadly poison, set on fire by hell itself. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's what happened to him. He has to be hurt. And so he warns us. Or maybe James is not the recipient of that pain, but it's the one who gives it. Maybe he is sitting by the windowsill full of bitter regrets over words that he said to someone else that, like that toothpaste, you cannot take him back. And he hears over and over again the words that were said to him, James, how could you? To which he says, yeah, how could I? Unbelievable. And maybe that's why he starts verse 2 with the words, all of us make mistakes. Can you relate to James in one way or the other? Friends, words have tremendous power, enormous power to build up or to destroy people. And we as children of God have an enormous responsibility to show the word, the power of words. Imagine how different this world would be, this nation, this town, your families, and even this church would be if we used all of our words to bless rather than to curse. How different we would be if we used our speech to build up rather than to tear down. If we constantly reminded each other that rather than being the people that we see each other to be, we are, every single person, a beloved, precious, treasured child of God, someone Jesus deemed worth of dying for. How different things would be. Do me a favor, turn to your bulletins for a moment. Check out your bulletin cover for this morning. I hope that this passage looks familiar. It is from 1 Peter 4, 8 to 11. It's our biblical story. It's our biblical foundation here at First Pres. And you can see the first couple of words, above all, love, right? Now go down to the middle of that section. See the words that are bolded? Read them with me, please. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. And by whoever, it means all of us here. You, it means all of us, every single one of us. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Words also matter. So what do we do? Well, surprise, surprise. If you study this passage carefully, if you look at every single word, and trust me, I did, you will be surprised to find out that nowhere here does James tell us to do anything at all. James includes absolutely no instruction in this section, so unlike last week's passage when he says, become doers of the word and not merely hearers. In this case, at least there we have some instruction, not today. Today, James is broken and negative, so pessimistic, all he can do is lament the effects of destructive speech. He is so distraught that he doesn't either bother telling us what to do. This is just a pronouncement of what should not be. I still see in my mind's eye James sitting by the window, on the windowsill, just hurting right there, writing these words. I don't know about you, but I want to go and sit right next to James. And my experience has been different. I want to sit by him and tell him, James, I know that words hurt, but it's not always like that. Words also bless. And I've experienced that. James just shakes his head. He's not ready for that. I say to him, James, it is not always like that. Our words can and do bless, and the people of God want to bless with their words. I remind James of the other words in the New Testament that say that the church and the world is to season this world with salt with their speech. He shakes his head. I remind him of the words of Paul that he says in Philippians, let your gentleness be known to everyone. And I say to him, the church, the people of God are hungry to do that. He doesn't believe me. I say to him that we read in the New Testament that we are to speak the truth in love. And I know that the words in love are often forgotten, but we are to speak the truth in love. Words that can bring the power to bless and to build up and to bring joy and hope. And I say to James, this is what the church does. I know I've been deeply moved with life-giving words in the past as well, but he just shakes his head and doesn't believe me. So I tell him about Dan. Dan was the member of a church where I grew up. Way back in 1994 during Holy Week, the pastor asked me to do a 20-minute monologue on the crucifixion as told from the character of Judas. It was straight from a book called Voices from the Cross, and he asked me, can you be Judas? Can you read this for the congregation? I said yes, and later on I found out that every single time I was chosen to be Judas for some weird reason. I don't know why. But in this case, he asked me to read this monologue on Judas, on the crucifixion, and I did, and the church left in silence. But before I left, Dan came walking from the back. Dan, really tall guy, really big hands. I remember he shook my hand and he said to me very clearly, if you ever consider seminary, I'd be happy to sponsor you. And he walked away. I have never, ever forgotten that moment. Never forgotten those words. I remember again where I was standing and the tone of his voice and exactly what he said. Words can bless. Words can build up. Words can paint vision. Words can bring hope. And most importantly, as children of God, words can point people to God and the work of God in this world. And I know that this experience is not unique to me. I know that you've been hurt with words in the past, but have you ever experienced life-giving words before? I think most of us, and I pray all of us have at one point or another. I can guarantee you life-giving words like, yes, I do. Or, congratulations, it's a girl. Or, I know it's tough, but you're going to make it and I'm right here with you. They say that the sweetest sound you will ever hear is the sound of your name from the lips of someone who loves you. I say, if that is true, then how much more, think of it, can the Spirit touch someone else's life through the power of your words? I say all of this to James. He's still on the windowsill, way too negative. He says, no, our speech is inflamed by the very fire of hell. I say to him, James, cheer up, man. Look, it doesn't have to be that way. No, it does, he says. He is so pessimistic, so hurt, and so broken. The tongue is a restless evil. It's full of poison. Do you agree with James? Some people would say that James is pessimistic. Others would say that he's a realist. Would you agree? He says no one can tame the tongue. To which I say, yeah. But that's not going to stop us from trying, is it? Because whether we like it or not, we are children of God, and words matter.